Hello. Welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany. In today's video, we're going to be talking about books with vampires. Today I have 10 book recommendations for you with all different approaches to vampire fiction. This ranges from science fiction to romance, queer vampires, vampires of color, classic vampires. There are so many different ways to approach this trope, and I've got 10 very different suggestions for you today if you're looking for some books about one of the classic monsters. Vampires are always coming in and out of fashion, but I feel like we've really been in a vampire boom over the last few years where we've been seeing quite a number of books with vampire stories coming out. And I want to suggest to you some books that I think are really great that have a different approach to the vampire. So today I have 10 book recommendations for you, things that I have read and really enjoyed that all have to do with vampires. But the first book we're going to talk about is Immortal Pleasures by Castro. This is a brand new book about an ancient Aztec vampire, which is a very interesting take on the trope. And I'm pleased to announce that this video is part of a tour that they're doing for this book as it's being released. This is not a paid promotion. It's something that I was excited to participate in, and so I decided to sign up for it. I was given an early audio copy of this book for review. Thank you to the publisher for that. And having read it, I think it's a really interesting approach to vampires. It's set with multiple timelines, so part of it is in the modern day, but our main character originated as an Aztec woman who was turned many hundreds of years ago after having been enslaved by Hernando Cortez. So we have part of the narrative in the modern day, her as a vampire who is now many hundreds of years old, working as an antiquities dealer and also searching for love, but perhaps getting caught up in the schemes of an ancient enemy. And then we have flashbacks to different periods in her life, from her early life before she became a vampire, and certain periods throughout her life as a vampire. This is a very modern book, despite all of the historical elements to it, and it's a little bit different because it is looking at the harm of colonization and the treatment of indigenous people, including women at the time, as well as getting into the stealing of cultural artifacts and the resale of them. So it's got some of this deeper thematic content piecemeal throughout it, while also being quite a sex-forward book. And maybe given the title, Immortal Pleasures, you might have anticipated that. But it was an interesting experience for me because there are quite a number of very explicit sex scenes that aren't really sexy. And I think that was maybe an intentional choice, although I'm not 100% certain. As somebody who does read quite a bit of romance and doesn't have a problem with sometimes reading erotic romance, I have read explicit scenes, but in this book, the kind of language and descriptors that are used is sometimes a little bit strange or unsettling or even cringeworthy. And without spoiling anything, given the story, I think it is very likely that that is intentional on the part of the author, and it's a very interesting choice to make. If you look at the Goodreads reviews for this book, you'll see people pulling out these lines that are a little bit like, what is happening? But as absurd as it sometimes is and as over the top as it sometimes is, it's also quite entertaining, and I think it's doing it in a somewhat self-aware way. So I ended up enjoying this book. I would read more if she decided to publish more in this world. I think there's definitely space for it, but it wasn't entirely what I was expecting. It's certainly a different take on a vampire novel. I think it's a cool concept, and if that sounds of interest to you, maybe go check it out. Thank you again to the publisher for including me on the tour and for sending me a copy for review. My next recommendation is one of my favorite books that I've read this year. I absolutely loved this, and that is Night's Edge by Liz Karen. This is a dystopian sci-fi take on vampires that is at its heart a story about a codependent and somewhat abusive mother-daughter relationship. It is set in a world with vampires, although it's something that's understood in a more medical way. And it follows a woman across two timelines. One is her as like a 9 or 10-year-old when her mother's abusive ex-boyfriend boyfriend first turns her into a vampire and her dealing with the aftermath of that. And it's kind of drawing some parallels between the vampirism and addiction is really a lot of what it reads like. And then we cut to the modern day where we see her still living at home with her mom, feeding her her blood every night, working by day in a bookshop, finally starting to have this late blooming burgeoning sexuality as she's developing interest in a lady barista at a local coffee shop. This to me was really heart-wrenching and very well written. I think it's a really interesting use of the vampire trope to talk about things like addiction and abuse and neglect. It's really smart and I loved it. I would definitely recommend it if that sounds like something you would enjoy. Pivoting in a very different direction, I'm also going to recommend Unholy Terrors by Lyndall Clipstone. This is a darker YA fantasy romance with a vampire element to it that is very heavy on the goth vibes and extremely melodramatic. This reads kind of like a high drama CW teen show. It feels like that mixed with the vibes of the Locked Tomb series by Tamsin Muir, I think Gideon the Ninth. It is a strong flavor that will not be for everyone, but if that sounds like something you could enjoy, I think it is really interesting. It is also a very satisfying fantasy standalone novel, so you're not diving into a series with this one. I should mention these are in no particular order. It's just the way in which I put them in a stack from my bookshelf. Next is Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is kind of a noir crime story take on vampires set in contemporary Mexico City. I'm a big fan of Silvia Moreno Garcia. She's one of my favorite authors, and I think this book from her is really interesting. It has a new cover, so I will post that up here. You maybe will recognize it more. I have the original hardcover. But this includes a character who is a descendant of Aztec blood drinkers, and it is drawing on a variety of different blood drinker vampire type mythologies, including Latine ones. This is a gritty crime noir type story with the seedy underbelly of Mexico City, but add in vampires. So if that sounds up your alley, maybe check out Certain Dark Things. I love what Silvia Moreno Garcia does. Another approach that feels a little bit more sci-fi than fantasy and is drawing on cultural anthropology and sociology is Fledgling by Octavia Butler. This is perhaps her most controversial book and one that people are very split on whether they like it or not, but it's also one of my favorite books from her. I think it's so smart and well executed and interesting, but it is uncomfortable to read, and intentionally so. This follows a character who appears to be a young black girl who has lost her memory, who is in fact 70 years old and the equivalent of an older adolescent vampire, except they're not called vampires, they're called something else. They are their own species that has a symbiotic relationship with humans. The thing that I think people find really uncomfortable about this is that this character looks like a child but is not a child and ends up seducing an adult human man, and the optics of that are very uncomfortable, and I think on purpose. I think Octavia Butler is doing that on purpose. One thing that I haven't heard a lot of people talk about is that this book turns into something of a courtroom drama later on. I just think that the world building and the way that she builds out the biology and culture of this vampire type is fascinating, and I'm a big fan of Octavia Butler. So if the content won't bother you, maybe go check out Fledgling. But back to some romantic melodrama, I'm going to suggest The Beautiful by Renee Audier. This is a completed series. There are 4 books in the series. I'm gonna say I didn't love the concluding volume. I think it was a little bit disappointing. However, I really love the rest of the series. And this first book reads like a slow burn murder mystery set in 1800s New Orleans and featuring vampires. Later in the series, it pulls in other fantastical creatures as well. There are strong romantic subplots to this, and I just think it's doing some really interesting things in terms of subverting some of the issues you see in books like Twilight, some of the things that it got wrong. I think The Beautiful is intentionally trying to change and reframe and correct, partly by centering queer characters and characters of color. So I really liked it. Maybe go check it out if it sounds up your alley. Next is another somewhat divisive book. Although I'll be honest, I feel like horror is often pretty divisive because people have very strong opinions about what they do and don't want in their horror, but I really liked this book. It is The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. This is humorous at times in a self-aware way, but is definitely more intense in terms of horror, and I think some people who picked it up weren't necessarily expecting so much graphic content in it, including sexual assaults. So heads up that that is depicted here, but I think this is a really good commentary on Southern white women and like nice or polite racism and the harm that it does. It definitely has some uncomfortable stuff, including, like I said, graphic sexual assault, suggested sexual assault of a minor, sort of. It's complicated because it's got vampires, but I thought this was well done and smart and also quite entertaining. I think when it came out though, it was a big bestseller and a lot of people were picking it up who don't typically read horror and maybe were a little shocked by some of the content. So keep that in mind. But I thought this was a really interesting version of a vampire story. Next is My Soul to Keep by Tananarive Due. This is the first book in the African Immortals series. Another bit of a different take on vampires, where we have people who originated in Africa who became immortal after drinking the blood of Christ, I think, which is a very interesting take on it. But it follows a particular character throughout different periods in his life through history, and then also it's got an element of the modern day where he falls in love with a woman and gets married and has a child, and kind of what happens. One thing I will say about this is it has what, for me at least, is one of the most intense scenes I've ever read in something that is more of a horror novel, because I would say this leans horror, which is what Tananarive Due is known for writing. And just, you know, go in with caution, especially if you're a parent. I do think I have a spoilery content warning on my Goodreads review if you need more details. But I think this was excellently written. I loved it. I really need to keep going with the series because I know there's more, but I thought this was really good. It was the first thing I ever read from her. Next we have Sapphic Gothic Vampires, and a book that is dealing with disordered eating. This is House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. I quite liked this. I think the ending wasn't entirely what I wanted it to be. It wrapped up a little bit neatly, but this definitely leans into the combination of violence and sensuality and seductiveness of vampires traditionally. It follows a young woman living in poverty who is kind of scooped out of it and given the opportunity to essentially become someone whose blood is fed on by a member of the aristocracy in exchange for the chance to become a wealthy woman and eventually win her freedom. But once she gets to this old kind of Gothic manor house, things quickly get very disturbing. So this is Gothic horror, it's queer, it's sapphic, and I really liked it. Ending aside, I think the ending could have been a little bit better, but overall, I really liked this. So if you're looking for some sexy sapphic vampires, no, not romance, it is not romantic, but there is sexy sapphic vampires, maybe try House of Hunger. And my final recommendation is a book that I think is kind of a modern classic at this point, and also offers more of a classic take on a vampire story. That is The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. I have not reread this in many, many years, but it was one of my favorite things when I did read it. I really should do a reread at some point. I remember it as being a very slow-paced, suspenseful novel that is drawing on the real history of Vlad Dracul, who inspired some of the legends of Dracula, but with a little bit of a twist. It's got a main character who is working on getting her PhD in history, and as somebody who's super nerdy and loves libraries and research and stuff like that, I just really liked all the descriptions of her doing research and going into the stacks and traveling around to track down clues about history and stuff. I thought it was really satisfying. So if you want something that's a little more of a modern classic, slow-paced, dark academia, maybe try The Historian. So there you go, 10 recommendations for vampire books, and I feel like we have a little something for everyone. We've got adult, we've got YA, we've got sexy, we've got horror, we've got romance, kind of a mix of things. And I do think it's interesting how many different ways people can use to tell and retell these stories of vampires that continue to have such a hold on our imaginations. I do think that some of my favorites of these books are ones that are playing with these issues of power dynamics and consent, because I think that that's where vampires can be used very well. There are these beings that are powerful and seductive and might have humans in their thrall, and how can we use that to talk about issues of power dynamics in relationships or in society for some of these books that are using it to talk about colonized and colonizer relationships or racial dynamics, for instance. I think there's a reason that vampires are often used in those ways. I think it's really effective. But anyway, those are my recommendations. I think there's a lot of really great books out there. And of course, if you're interested, be sure to go check out Immortal Pleasures by Castro as soon as it releases. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts or feelings on anything in this video. And for question of the day, recommend to me your favorite piece of media about vampires. This might be a movie or a TV show or a book. What is something that you really love that you think has an interesting approach to this classic monster? Let me know in the comments down below. If you like this video, it always helps if you give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.